Thank you. Thanks. Oh, I do feel like a fraud talking to you today because I'm not going to present the outcome of a research project or anything that is based on, exciting museum practice of the kind I've been hearing these 2 days here. But it's mostly my thoughts, if you can take that. Um, I've been trying to think aloud, and I would like to share my thoughts with you. And much of it is aspirational and tentative, and probably very naive. So feel free to come back hardly me afterwards. But the thing is, I wanted to when I got this proposition to be here today. And there was this word in the title, hope. And I wanted to try to engage with that. And it interrogates me. It's interesting. It's ambivalent. Of my feelings towards hope are ambivalent. So I wanted to try to understand a bit more that emotion and go deeper a little bit and see whether it's possible maybe to qualify it. The sense of hope is so broad, so vague. So beginning with understanding it a bit better and then trying to think of ways in which we could work with it in museums from a more informed standpoint, perhaps. So when you look into hope theory, and what I'm going to talk about today is mostly theoretical, really abstract. I'm going to find it kind of insubstantial, but bear with me. When you look into theorization of hope, that happens across a broad spectrum of disciplines. It's really, really broad and increasing in terms of material and perspectives. What I have been looking at for this paper is mostly the field of psychology and sociology of emotions. And I've tried to disentangle some ideas that might be interesting to look into when you consider how we might apply notions of hope in museum practice with this idea of qualifying it. So the questions I am asking myself really, and I'm trying to think about in this intervention, are small questions, as you can see. What is hope? Who should practice hope? Hope for whom? How might we hope in museums? And then closing with some inclusive thoughts on all that. So, what is hope? Here, I just wanted to propose you what is the consensual definition in psychology and sociology. Hope is defined as the perceived capability to derive pathways to desired goals and motivate oneself via agency thinking to use those pathways. So here I've put in bold the three elements that define hope. It is the presence of goals. We need a goal we want to reach, pathway thinking. We need some sort of plan in our head on how to attain that goal. We need agency, we need motivation, we need a driver to get there. So in the literature, there's a constellation of sub-concepts, nuances of hope, radical hope, grounded hope. There's plenty of interesting declinations of that concept. Here, I just wanted to focus on a distinction between two concepts that I think could be interesting for museum practice. And the first one is the distinction between false hope and constructive or active hope. False hope is the belief that something is based on the belief that something beyond the human, something above us, God, the universe, fate, will solve the problem. Versus constructive or active hope is to believe that human intervention is important, is bringing agency, human agency in. And the other distinction is between representational hope versus non-representational hope. Non-representational hope is generic, doesn't have a specific referent, whereas representational hope is specific. We hope for something very specific. So I wanted to stress here representational, that is specific, agentive hope. I'm doing that because the problem with hope is that too much of it might lead us to complacency. We might think that everything is going to be okay at the end anyway, and that brings us to disengage. But when you bring in representational hope that is specific and it is agentive, then you have, as in specificity, you have a hook to action. We can act if there is that specific referent, and then that can help us to counter complacency. And then the last point I wanted to put forward in this kind of introduction is that hope can be learned. I was interested in learning about this actually. Hope has been conceptualized as a practice and a skill that one can develop. And that can be done through hope therapy, which is a set of hope-enhancing interventions that are acting on these three variables. For instance, interventions that are helping an individual to formulate clearer goals, reachable, attainable, realistic goals, or helping an individual to come up with multiple ways to reach a goal, creating that mental flexibility, creativity, plasticity to create options to reach the goal. And then mastering this energy, this motivation that is the driver, the agency element for hope. So just a few elements here to give you a sense that hope is much more than an emotion. It is an act of will, it is a state of mind, it is a skill, it is a practice, and of course it's an ethos, it's an ontology as well, a way of inhabiting the world. Now, to those questions that I put forward, who should practice hope? If we take an historical perspective, we can see that colonialism has instrumentalized hope. It promised colonized peoples to partake in the promise of modernity, in the dream of modernity, promising wealth, material wealth, promises civilization, even the Christian idea of promising the salvation of the soul. And in a similar way, so did modernity and capitalism themselves. They promised the illusion of unlimited growth and this idea of linear progress and so on. So there are historical grounds to distrust hope, in a sense, or at least some sections of the population might feel that they have been let down by these hopes. And there's a sociologist of emotions, Hage, who has shown that the conditions for hope are unequally distributed. That is, those with status and power have more access to hope resources. So to be able to hope, in a sense, is a privilege. And then, what we are, if we are inviting hope among the least advantaged sections of the population, is that another way of abusing power, perhaps? We could, think along those lines as well. Another question that I am trying to think about and I'm struggling with is hope for whom? Do we hope for other humans? Do we hope for non-humans as well, the planet? If we only focus our hopes on wishes for other humans, does then hope become another expression of anthropocentrism, as if we needed yet another one? But then hoping for the non-human, I think that opens up for a host of questions. What do we hope for the non-human, for instance? In parallel, I'm doing some work on the cultural, affective significance of glaciers and the disappearance of glaciers. And in that context, I might ask myself, what might I hope for a glacier, for instance? But then the way we formulate our hopes for the non-human might run the risk to just project human needs and human desires onto the non-humans, isn't it? So instead of asking myself, what might I hope for a glacier, I might ask, what might a glacier ask? What might a glacier hope for? And I think that just playing with that ontological shift as a theoretical exercise does something interesting to our very notions of hope, for instance, just extending, stretching it. And I think that that work, engaging in this kind of thinking, is also important for intergenerational hope, for how future generations are going to hope, what they're going to hope for, in what ways, and so on. So now coming a little bit closer to hope in museums. In sociology of emotions, there are studies that hope that show that hope receives validation and support in responsive social contexts. So I wonder whether museums can be those validating, responsive social contexts. And I have tried to think of ways in which, we can. I really don't want to be prescriptive about this. This is not about giving a recipe, but just it's my thinking process. Can I think of some points of departure to begin to think of how we could engage with hope in museums? And I came up with this. And really, don't take this as a list. It doesn't want to be dogmatic. It's really to be opened up. I talked before about, I just mentioned representational, specific, agentive hope. And the idea here is whenever we evoke hope in museums, I would like to be, again, I speak for myself, I'd like to be able to be specific about hope, to formulate it in a way that is achievable, is attainable, is concrete, adding something very concrete that every one of us can do. And in many instances, in observing, museum exhibitions, for instance, I find that the message of hope is there, but tends to be very generic, very broad, formulated in very abstract terms. For instance, a hope in human ingenuity, human intelligence, or there's a narrative that says, well, historically there have been ups and downs, and there have been crises, they have been solved. This too will pass in a way. And kind of normalizing. And I understand that those are, they can be uplifting narratives and soothing, and we absolutely need that at this point. But that is also a kind of hope that is passive and it's self-illusory in a sense. And I don't think that's what I want from a museum. I don't want that kind of passivity, is positive storytelling in itself, because that is not what is going to foster emotional resilience, which is ultimately the bottom line here, I think. So instead of, having this general optimistic narratives, could we focus on something that is, as in this case, a presentation on specific agentive, and on small hope? I found this quite interesting as a concept, as a sociologist called Kasagord who put this forward. It distinguishes between the big hopes, such as, we're going to solve the ecological crisis, and small hopes, something very narrow, like I'm going to do less harm, something very achievable and realistic, and combining that with this specificity and agency. And small hope could be something that we can relate to, begin to relate to. Another idea that I kind of, again, I'm dreaming up here. Museum collections as technologies of hope. The notion of technology of hope, I borrow it from the health sector, the healthcare sector, where it refers to the interventions that are meant to keep a patient's hope high throughout the illness. And so, what do I mean by collections as technologies of hope? Well, collections can be an archive, a sort of arsenal of hope resources, I think. In what terms? Hope, we intuitively we know it's a future-oriented emotion. It's about what we hope for the future, but it's also arcing back to the past. Hope builds on our past achievements. This is a kind of this is a basic psychological mechanism whereby hope develops over time as we learn the connection between our goals and our actions. And that's irrespective of the outcome, whether we were successful or not, that's less important. But it's learning that connection between goals and actions that is nurturing hope. So there are, in our collections, there are virtually infinite stories that we can tell of, whether they were successes or failures, doesn't matter, but storytelling where we emphasize that connection between the goals we had and our actions. And by making that connection in storytelling, nurturing this process of learning hope from our past achievements. Something very, may sound quite banal actually, but studies in sociology show that hope is enhanced by activities that involve other people, connections with the environment, with the senses, with materials, embodied experiences, practical work. And we've heard so much of that here these 2 days. And museums are, grounded, are locally rooted, perhaps sometimes not knowing very well their constituencies, their communities, but they are in the position of doing that. They are in the vernacular, they are in the local, they are dealing with materials, they are dealing with the senses, with embodied experiences, with natural environments. All those potentials or resources are already there. Perhaps we can just overlay an awareness that we can activate all that with a sense that it can be hope enhancing and giving that even more, intentionality in that respect. And I mentioned hope therapy, and I find that there's something quite interesting in that as well. There's a lot of therapeutic intervention already going on in museums, which I found interesting, encouraging. I think there's scope also for hope therapy, bringing in or collaborating with therapists and harnessing the unique material and immaterial resources of museums to do hope therapy in a different context, which is so important because museums are not stigmatizing places usually versus a hospital, for instance, and so on. So these are just a few examples that came to my mind in thinking around this. But then I wanted to conclude with 2 transversal perspectives, 2 transversal priorities, I think, that I would love any hope-related activity in museums to be permeated of these 2 perspectives. And the first one is about imagination. All kinds of hope are rooted in imagination. So what if museums can take part in this collective imaginative process and provide opportunities and inspiration for dreaming different futures? This is what has been called anticipatory work, that is leveraging on emotions and imagination to envision desirable futures in a plural, again, not being prescriptive about what that future should be. But for instance, could we use collections to stimulate imagination that is object-centered and science-based, for instance? I'm thinking one, banal example, but early 20th century models of car operated by steam water engines. And it's just objects that are in museum collections. But what if we could tell the story, an alternative story of the 20th century based on that object? What if we had gone down that road of car operated by steam engines? How would, the old century and history be different? Or, there's plenty of potential examples of telling alternative stories in museums. I have the impression that this work, this imaginative work, is being done. It is being done. We've seen in these couple of days in collaborative projects, in groups, and so on. But the museum itself engaging in this kind of imagination. I find that sometimes I have the impression, I might be wrong, and please do correct me, but I have the impression that museums are a little bit hesitant to engage in this anticipatory work. They're a little bit hesitant to go into these imaginative landscapes. Maybe they're not feeling they're so sound, scientifically solid, but I do believe, I'm persuaded that this is so important, this work of imagining together, and there's a role for museums there, I think, to play more forcefully. And the last point, the last transversal cross-cutting priority, in my sense, is something that has come up this morning as well already. The fact that we, as societies, we tend, sorry for generalizing so brutally, but we tend to have little tolerance for psychological discomfort. We want the narrative to be positive. We want to be reassured. And of course, museums as social institutions, often receiving public money, feel under pressure, may feel under pressure to align with that. And of course, we agree that museums shouldn't be spreading panic, but still, there's an opportunity, I think, for museums to play a role in fostering emotional resilience in this, through this capacity to tolerate the discomfort and staying with this trouble Haraway talked about. I think it's one precious opportunity in staying with trouble and staying with the discomfort to become more resilient. I just want to close with a quote by climate journalist Diego Arguedas Ortiz, who is drawing on the work of philosopher Victoria Maguire. And Ortiz writes, learning to hope as adults in our increasingly individualistic societies requires new scaffolding. I agree with Ortiz that we need to learn to hope as adults, which I take to mean learning to hope in ways that embrace uncertainty and embrace also the discomfort of uncertainty. But we also do need scaffolding, and that's where I think I'd love to see museums coming in more importantly with providing or being part of the institutions, the social cultural institutions out there that contribute to provide that scaffolding that we need. Yes, I'll stop here.